Yes, thank you, Deetra. Appreciate that very much. My name is Greg Rohde, and I have the privilege of chairing the very last panel. So I know that we're the last thing between all of you and lunch. But I promise you, this panel is going to be a lot like a happy hour. You're going to experience something beautiful, something interesting, and something's going to make your head hurt. So we have three very distinct topics that we're going to cover. First, for the something beautiful, we have with us Ella Jakubowska. She's with the European Digital Rights, where she advocates on behalf of individual privacy rights. Her presentation is going to remind us of the truism that technology can be a wonderful servant, but a horrible master. She attempts to address this perpetual problem, or challenge, I should say, of how do we balance security and safety along with individual privacy. So with that, Ella, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. So, hi everyone. It's fantastic to be here today. I work as a policy advisor at EDRi, European Digital Rights, which is Europe's biggest network of civil society organizations protecting people's human rights in the digital age. And so we really focus on how privacy and data protection impact across the full range of people's human rights. Sorry, I'm just trying to move my slide on. There we go. And so, of course, we focus on human rights to privacy and data protection, but we also really conceptualize of those rights as being gateway rights for all other human rights. Human rights don't stand on their own, but in fact, we really focus also on rights such as free expression and assembly, on rights to non-discrimination, and how these rights can be impacted by the increasing use of data and technology. And of course, we share, I think, a lot of aims in the work that we do, because the right to life and rights to safety and security are also fundamental rights. And just to give maybe a bit of background about what's brought me here and why I think this is something that is a really great topic for us to be discussing today, is to kind of share that I myself come from a background working for a technology company. In fact, for the last few years that I was there, I worked in the computer science team. So I'm very interested in technology and very much buy into the idea that technology can be a force for huge benefits for our society, as long as we keep people and humans at the center. I also have a lot of my, in fact, close family members and friends who work as first responders, as well as in the criminal justice system. So I have a profound respect for the work of the emergency services. But as a human rights defender and somebody who works in the political space, I'm also profoundly aware of kind of the risks of some technologies in our society. To give one example, just last week, you might have heard of the Catalan gate scandal, where my organization, EDRi, was actually impersonated, allegedly by the Spanish government, although we're waiting for judicial investigations to confirm this. And that was used to deploy spyware against opposition politicians, journalists, and human rights defenders. So it's very real to me, very tangible in my job, how we can see both sides of the coin when it comes to technology. And one of the key topics on which I work is biometrics. So when I talk about biometrics and biometric data, what I'm referring to are things like people's fingerprints, facial images, even how people walk, so their gait, sometimes even how they smell, which have all been used in different technological systems to uniquely identify people, and therefore to have the potential to track them across time and place. So our focus when it comes to biometrics is looking at how we can make sure that the use of biometric data is safe and responsible, and to ensure that we prevent uses that could lead to biometric mass surveillance. And so as at EDRi, part of our work is to coordinate, as you can see here, our Reclaim Your Face campaign against biometric mass surveillance. And to be clear, I'm not talking here about things like unlocking your smartphone with your fingerprint or a biometric access badge. Those are very different use cases. The sorts of examples that we focus on and trying to make sure that they are human rights compliant are uses like facial recognition in public spaces used against, for example, people who are demonstrating, people who are protesting. And we'd call that a form of remote biometric identification or remote biometric recognition. And I wanted to share now a quote from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who I think sums up why we pay so much attention to biometric data, far better than I could, just to really emphasize why biometric data, in fact, is already specially protected in EU law, and why we just need to be so careful about how we use it. So the High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, says that remote biometric recognition, such as facial recognition in public spaces, is linked to a deep interference with the right to privacy. A person's biometric information constitutes one of the key attributes of his or her personality. And she goes on to talk about how the use of these systems can dramatically increase the ability of state authorities to systematically identify and track individuals in public spaces, which undermines everyone's ability to go about their lives unobserved and can have a direct negative effect on many fundamental rights. So, my focus, of course, is on privacy, but what I really want to emphasize today is that privacy and safety are mutually reinforcing rights. In the work that I do with some EU institutions, we sometimes find privacy and safety, privacy and security pitted against one another, and I don't think this is a helpful dichotomy for any of us. In fact, without privacy, we can all be vulnerable, and we also rely on being safe and on being secure in order to enjoy our rights to privacy. To give a different example, one of the other topics on which I work is encryption. And we're expecting next month that the European Commission is going to put forward a law which might actually undermine the use of encryption across the EU. And this is deeply, deeply concerning for us because encryption is not just something that keeps individuals safe as they communicate privately, but it's essential for secure bank transactions, for people to communicate with lawyers and doctors in confidentiality. It's important for even governments and security services to safeguard valuable information. So that's an example of how we really see privacy and security and safety coming together in a way that benefits all of us. But I also want to make sure that I'm not just talking in the abstract, in hypotheticals, but to actually share with you some real examples that our researchers and our investigators have found in previous years that highlight some of the risks that come with the use of biometric data for public safety. And the first example is one you've probably heard of. It's Clearview Ai, the notorious US-based company that offer facial recognition analytics services based on a database of billions of facial images. And they've scraped these images from the internet, so the chances are that probably all of us, or the vast majority of us in this room, will be in Clearview Ai's databases, because if you have an online presence, social media, on your organization's website, you will probably have had your image scraped by them. And we know for certain that Clearview Ai's database and analytics have been used by law enforcement and other authorities in Sweden, Belgium, and Italy at a minimum. There are suspicions of other agencies using it as well. And this has actually been ruled illegal by data protection and other kind of watchdog organizations in each of those countries. In fact, the Italy example recently saw a 20 million euro fine being levied on the agency that was using Clearview Ai due to the fact that it's in contradiction to our data protection rights that are enshrined in EU law. We're not supposed to have our sensitive biometric data, our facial images that can be used to track us across time and place, used unless such a use is necessary and proportionate. So when you think about these mass Clearview Ai databases, it's almost as if every single one of us is being put in this perpetual lineup. Every single one of us is being treated as a potential suspect, which really reverses the presumption of innocence, and so is something that we are really keen to discourage. But despite the fact that we've had all of these rulings and now fines indicating that the use of Clearview Ai databases is illegal in the EU, we are still seeing, thanks to investigations, that a number of European governments are still pursuing the use of these systems. To give a different example, going to Italy now, specifically, in the city of Como, in the last few years, we saw the introduction of what was referred to as a smart surveillance system. And the intention of the system was to detect and deploy responses to people loitering or trespassing. And this was a system that processed various types of people's biometric data. But in fact, rather than being used for public safety purposes, what actually happened is that this system was deployed in a park where hundreds of migrants and asylum seekers were sleeping rough, so were currently homeless, after having failed to cross the Swiss-Italian border. And so these systems were, instead of keeping people safe, were used to, in a really punitive way, to kind of discourage these people who were in a very vulnerable situation and had no alternative place to go, to try and force them to move along in ways that really we feel would have been much better tackled by taking a more kind of humane, human approach to thinking how we can help these people rather than using technology, in effect, to punish them. And that example from Italy was also surrounded by some really serious procurement problems. There was highly racist language used in the tender from the company that put forward that system that was eventually chosen. And there was Huawei facial recognition technology being offered by a third party so that Huawei's name didn't appear in the tender documents. And this is also a pattern that we've seen, especially in Africa, where Huawei facial recognition technology that's been linked to a series of human rights violations around the world is being pushed to various authorities under other names. And we've also heard anecdotal evidence of some companies offering their technology for free to certain authorities to try and avoid procurement rules and transparency rules about what needs to be declared in public procurement. So my last slide is what can we do about it? Because I really think we have the same aims about protecting people. And one of the things that I think we can do collectively is to shift our thinking to really focus on that interdependence between privacy on the one hand and safety and security on the other, and to see them as two sides of the same coin rather than something in opposition. And I think that's something that we can see in the public safety sphere, but also in the field that I work in on the digital rights side. I think we can also do more to foster that collaboration and really recognize that we are working for the same aims. In addition, we can also make sure to embed privacy by design and privacy by default in new technology. These are principles that are embedded as well in EU fundamental rights and data protection law. And that means that we should be really mindful about the designs of systems that we're buying. We should make sure that there's no sharing of data without proper authorizations, and we should minimize the risks of data breaches. And to give you one example of where we've seen that done, unfortunately, not very well, is in Portugal, where at the end of last year, there was a proposal to enhance certain CCTV systems with additional facial recognition capabilities. But an investigation revealed that the CCTV control room was entered directly from the street and the door was not always locked, and that access to these systems containing very sensitive data was accessible via just one single, very simple password. So there was not even a way to check who was accessing what data. So when we think about the risks of abuses and the accountability there, that setup really obscured the possibility to have accountability. And so the thought about bringing in facial recognition when you've got those very basic flaws and kind of mismanagement of certain systems is really risky. And so we want the idea of privacy by design and default to be at the center of our decisions. Related to that is the principle of data minimization, so only gathering and storing data that's strictly necessary and proportionate. And that's really important when it comes to biometric data because, as I said earlier, data about people's faces, other parts of them that can identify them forever and eliminate, destroy their capacity to ever be anonymous, needs to be treated with the proper respect, the proper care for how sensitive those data are. So we would encourage that the collection of data and the processing of data and the storage of data is always done on the basis of a genuine need, a documented justification, and never on the basis of just in case. Fourth, when it comes to procurement, I think some of the examples I've shared already show that there is a need for some real due diligence and in some cases a reform of procurement processes to make sure that systems that are not lawful, systems that are dangerous are not procured. And on that point, as someone with a background in the tech sector, I would encourage to always have a healthy skepticism for what tech companies and what marketing brochures say that a system is actually able to do, and particularly whether it's data protection compliant. I can't tell you how many times I've looked on websites where biometric companies have said that their systems comply with EU law, when we know for a fact that they very clearly do not. And finally, gone too fast, no mass surveillance databases. So it's really important to kind of stay away from the Clearview Ai's, the PIMIs of the world, and instead, if we're building databases or maintaining databases that contain people's most sensitive data, to make sure that there's a proper legal basis, that there are safeguards, that people are in there only based on reasonable suspicion. To give my very last example, we've again seen a shocking example where that hasn't happened, where tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people were in a Dutch facial recognition database without any suspicion, without any legal basis, and without any process to be able to actually remove their data from that database. So that was it from my presentation. I'll now take a question, and thank you.
I have a question. I flew over here on Air France, and when I was getting on my plane in Paris to come to Marseille, I'm an old-fashioned guy, so I get my boarding pass printed out, and I had that little slip of paper in my hands. And I went to the boarding gate, and they just had me stand in front of a screen, and a little green light went off, and they said, go ahead, go on the plane. They're using biometric data that they have on me. That strikes me as a reasonable, appropriate use of biometric data. I have no problem with that. In fact, it's going to clear my pockets of these awful little pieces of paper eventually. Do you have any guiding principles to offer about how do we distinguish between appropriate uses of biometric data and also inappropriate uses that bring to some of the abuses that you just talked about? What principles do you have to offer for that?
The example that you just shared, I think, can be completely acceptable if people have control over that data. People have voluntarily given that data. They know where it's going. Those are kind of principles that can really help inform whether or not that use case is legitimate. But also I would encourage people to look at the underlying database, because if it's your airline, for example, we're seeing a lot of airlines starting to do boarding and verifying your ticket using your face. And we would ask, are you confident with what's happening to that data? Are you sure that the airline isn't going to be selling that data? Do you know where it's actually going to go? And I know people tend not to read the terms and conditions, but that's one example where we would say, make sure that in that use case that your data are being properly respected. But as long as that use is individual, you have the control, the data is being kept safe, I would say that is acceptable. And even in first response, there are legitimate uses of biometric data. We're not trying to say it can never be used. It's just about distinguishing between those uses that are controlled, that respect people's rights, compared to those where if you're being mass surveilled with facial recognition at a protest and you have no ability to object and it could be used for nefarious means, political persecution, that's where we would draw the line.
One last question. And I believe it's point number 4 or 3, I can't remember which one, where you mentioned that for new technology, we should look at embedding by design and by default certain privacy protections. Can you give at least one example of that? How would that play out? How would you embed by design or default privacy protections in new technology?
Well, for example, if you're setting up a database and you're collecting 10 types of data, one practical thing you could do would be to look at each data category and say, do we need this specific piece of data? One trend we've seen is the increasing use of biometric data for racial profiling. That's a clear example of, do we really need to be collecting in a public space people's predicted ethnicity based on a surveillance system? So just having that simple sense check that says, do we need to have this piece of data or not, I think is a good place to start.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Please thank Ella for your presentation.
Thank you.